In the year 2028, a man hiked the Appalachian Mountains. This man's name was William. He decided to take some time for himself after going through a separation with his wife, and hike the entire trail. The sun began to set, so Will chose to set up camp for the night. He found a nearby cave, and after checking for any traces of animals, he made it suitable to rest in. William was an Army veteran. Camping was a hobby of his, a survivalist. With his wife taking the children, he had no reason to have a home anymore. His dreams either haunted him or made him miss everything he lost, so sleep was rare for this lost soul. In the early morning hours of the day, before the sun ever crested the sea, William was shook awake by a vicious bang. He ran out of the cave. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. A sky full of fire, extreme flashes in all directions, the sounds on incoming missiles echoed across the land. He thought this was just a dream. He ran back into the cave and grabbed his phone. He tried calling his wife, and had no signal. Looking at the entrance of the cave, a flash and loud crashing noise rushed into the cave. It was here when William knew it was a nuclear missile strike. He did his best to seal off the entrance to the cave with rocks and boulders to prevent fallout or excess radiation to get in. It took hours of tireless work for William to feel comfortable with his makeshift barrier. William sat down on the cave floor, draping his sleeping bag over him, and decided to eat one of his protein bars. He took an inventory of his supplies. While eating, he knew he'd have to ration everything. He had enough food to last him 2 weeks, but only enough water for 3 days at the most. He knew he could collect moisture off the roof of the cave, but wouldn't be enough to sustain him. It was at this moment when he realized everything he'd ever known was gone. His wife, his children, all gone. It was a crippling feeling, and as hardened as he was, all could bring himself to do was sit there in the dark and debate on walking out into the world and dying with them. Minutes turned into hours, hours into days. He fashioned a water collection device out of his wet weather clothing and a poncho. He kept himself busy by working on his new home, improving everything he could with his hands, even crafting tools out of stone and rope. Soon 2.5 weeks had passed. His rations were running low. He knew he'd have to leave the safety of the cave and hunt for food. He knew the radiation would have died down some after all this time, hopefully none impacted close enough to do damage to the forest around him. He began to remove the stones of his door to the cave entrance, peeking out between the gaps in the stones. The light was blinding, his eyes accustomed to the darkness of the cave. William grabbed all his waterproof material, knowing it would hold up best against radiation, secured it to his body, making a hasty radiation suit. He put on his gloves and removed the rest of the stones, stepping out of the cave and feeling the warmth of the sun for the first time in weeks. Still weeks later, he could see smoke pluming in the distance all around him. He wondered who all could have survived the strike. He knew he couldn't be alone, so he was careful but hopeful, wanting to find other people, but weary of their desperation. He ventured out into the forest, gathering branches, setting up traps for animals, fashioning a bow and arrows for hunting. Just as he finished crafting his bow, he heard one of his nearby snares go off. William ran towards the trap. His eyes lit up when he saw the rabbit dangling. He returned to his cave, now starting a fire and cooking his freshly caught dinner. This cycle continued for months, just him by himself. He decorated his cave and ventured further and further out, constantly debating on ending his life just so he wouldn't have to be alone anymore. Then one day, while on a hunt, he came across a vehicle parked in the woods, looked recently occupied. William checked the vehicle for any usable gear, finding some canned food and a duffel bag of clothes. He debated taking it. If he did, it may lead to the deaths of whoever the vehicle belonged to. After a moment, he put the items back in the vehicle and turned to leave. Then a shot rang out, a round just missing William. He reacted, seeking cover behind the engine block. He readied his bow and an arrow. Then a second shot. He knew exactly where this attacker was from the sound of the weapon. He changed position, came up and out of cover, and let loose an arrow. He dropped back down and waited for another shot. The shot never came. He sat there for what felt like an hour waiting. Finally, he maneuvered his way towards where the shots came from, finding a man with an arrow in his throat, sitting against a tree. William, with his bow drawn and ready, approached the man, quickly seeing he was dead. Will shook that he just killed a man, but his thoughts calmed as he picked up the man's hunting rifle and backpack full of ammo. He scavenged through the vehicle and returned to his cave. Before he knew it, 2 years had passed. Venturing into the woods became his daily routine. William built himself a small fortress around his cave. Traps littered the area around his home. One day as he skinned a deer, he heard a woman scream. He slung his rifle and ran in the direction of the noise. A woman caught in one of his traps, a log pinning her leg to the ground. She screamed and begged for her life as she saw him, pure panic in her eyes. William put down his rifle and lifted the log off her leg. He struggled to explain that he meant her no harm, since it had been years since he spoke. He carried her back to his cave, set and splinted her leg, and cared for her as it healed. Her name was Miranda, and William became her impromptu provider. She gave him a reason to keep going, and they quickly became friends. He taught her how to survive as he had. Then as the nights got colder, their relationship became more than platonic. After a few months, Miranda became pregnant, which scared William more than anything had before. The idea of bringing a child into this world, where every day is fought for with blood and sweat, terrified him. William began venturing to nearby towns up to 30 miles away, finding books about child care, medications for her, and even enough powder formula to last months. Unfortunately, he always felt he was being watched as he entered these old, abandoned towns. Months passed and Miranda's water broke. William had to deliver his own child, amazed that the process went without any complications. For a while they were happy. William loved his new daughter unconditionally, never speaking of his former family in fear Miranda would think less of him for not protecting them. One day while out checking his traps, William caught a shadow of a man in the trees, raising his rifle. Thinking he was seeing things, maybe he was finally slipping. He was almost 50 years old now. Then a shot rang out, striking William in the shoulder, spinning him around completely. He sought cover behind a tree and located the shooter. Holding his rifle in his position, put a round through his stomach through his concealment. William approached and disarmed the man, interrogating him at gunpoint. The man was a member of a group of raiders who had been watching William scavenging the towns. They figured he had something worth taking if he was willing to go out so far to get supplies. Most people nowadays roam, no one sets up camp. The man said that they have men all over this forest, and they'll be coming for the shots. William picked up the man's bolt-action rifle, and said, "You should have stayed away," and executed him. William ran back to his cave and family. He told Miranda to stay in the cave, and stay quiet at all costs. He blocked off the entrance from the outside. She argued with him, wanting to fight alongside him. Without a word he covered the cave with stones, as he did when the bombs first landed. He took vegetation, and concealed it the best he could. Then set out to hunt the raiders. William ran about half a mile, and let off a shot to bring the raiders to him. Then all around him he heard yelling, then the sounds of his traps going off, and then screams. He smiled, knowing his traps would thin them out. He still didn't know how many men he was up against. After a few minutes he heard branches breaking near his position. He readied his rifle, and waited for a clean shot. As the silhouette of a man came clear, he depressed the trigger, and sent a round clear through his chest. As soon as the man hit the forest floor, a barrage of rounds impacted near William. He moved through the woods like a ghost, killing man after man, one by one. Every so often noticing a sharp pain, but pushing through to keep fighting. As the sun began to set, he still fought, scavenging ammunition from corpses. As the last man fell, so did William, finally collapsing from bloodless and pain. Looking down at himself, he finally could notice all the wounds he had taken, fashioning tourniquets out of dead men's clothing. He dragged himself all the way back to his cave, seeing all the raiders killed by his traps, laughing at them, killed by traps meant for dinner. Finally reaching the cave, yelling for Miranda to help uncover the stones. She kicked her way out and rushed to his side. She sobbed at the sight of him, so badly wounded. William, however, smiled. He had survived through so many fights, so many days he suffered. He wasn't going to die when he finally had something to live for. He felt pride for the first time in years, finally protecting his family the way he should have years ago. They remained in that cave for years to come. William taught his daughter everything she needed to survive in this world, how to be a hunter, a provider, and a monster when needed. William finally became the kind of man he always wanted to be, a father,